Welcome. Hello. Thank you for coming. I'm so delighted to be able to talk to Sarah about her most excellent book, Lee Lozano Dropout Piece, which just came out from Afterall Books. And before we get started, I wanted to thank Laura Owens and Wendy Yao, Ethan Swan for making yet again another event at 356 move so smoothly, and Jacob Hesse, who did Jeff Hesse, sorry, with flustered, excited, for the really delicious granola bars. If you've not had them, so tasty. And also the soundtrack that was playing to this piece was put together by Jeff and is Lozano tuned. And one song that Sarah told me about is The Toys Smoke Two Joints, which is, you know, the lyric is something like, I smoke two joints and then I,
before I smoke two more.
Okay,
yeah. So that's for Lozano in her honor.
You should be seeing a green cross outside Ooga Booga by the time you leave this event, so if we're lucky. So this is Hollis Frampton's Manual of Arms, and that is Lee Lozano. And so what I'm going to do is, the first question is related to the Lee in this film and the Lee on the cover of this book. And then I have clustered 10 sentences or so, because they're excellent sentences that Sarah has written about Lee, and those are going to be the prompts for discussion between the two of us. So that's how we're just going to let things unfold. So the first question I'll read, and I'm going to read and try to be extemporaneous as well. Behind us, looping and leaping joyously from then to now and back again and again, has been a segment of Hollis Frampton's Manual of Arms, a segment of which starred Lee Lozano. Lozano is beaming and giggling, clearly smitten with Frampton and his camera's attention and whatever he might be saying to her. A similar smiling, charismatic Lee looks out from us on the cover of Sarah's book. And now I'm going to turn this way. Let's see. I see your efforts as providing and exuberant, which isn't to say in any manner uncomplicated or straightforward reframing of how Lozano looks. Not any merely angry artist who boycotted women, how her work looks, and perhaps most crucially and mind-expandingly reorienting what her work means and how. Was that joyful Lozano available from the start, or did she appear that way to you only deep into the project?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, I think. Well, she appeared to me joyful fairly early on, but certainly not at the beginning. And actually, during the process of working on my master's under you on Lee Lozano, and the turning point for that, because she is often thought of or remembered for the boycott, for general strike, for these really hardcore positions she staked out, that the strength of which are not diminished at all by the joyfulness that I found in her. But I found that really when I found the notebooks, the private notebooks, which are these 11 small memo pad notebooks that are colorful, that are really meticulously kept, that are in great condition, that are full of, and they say private man on the cover. They're like private, but whatever that means with her, that's always complicated. But they're full of jokes and puns and exuberance and a lot of notes on her sex life and drug use, and reading that I mean, it's remained the most important text for me from her, and I consider the body of those to be the central corpus of her work for me and what I'm working on. So those notebooks, that's where she lives, I think, for me, and is like so alive in that. And then, I mean, that loop that was on is the only film footage I've seen of her, and that's from '66. But when you see that and then you see this, I mean, it's like, I don't know, I can't help but fall in love. She's amazing. And so, and that's the thing too, like when I talked with people who specifically, which comes up, and maybe we'll get to it another point too, but specifically Stephen Kaltenbach, who she was close with, and then Gary Moorhead, who she lived with after dropping out. Both of them in particular were very important for my research on this book, and 40 years later, the love that they have for her continues to be so strong and palpable, and really the main impression that I get from talking to them, and their memory is so specific and like it's striking, and they both emphasize the fun that they had, like how much fun she was. So that is, I think, really important to keep in mind with her in general, but especially in the context of Dropout Piece, which I wouldn't want. I know that I've gotten some feedback. I know that it can be slanted or read, I think, as a sad story or something, but I think it's much more complicated than that. So it's good to keep her smiling and on the cover.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because my first question goes to the Dropout piece, and I'll read two sentences which kind of try to, Sarah's so particular in giving contour to this very fraught, challenging piece of work. And I think it's called Dropout Piece, and that dropping out might be joyful is maybe one of the first complications in terms of this. So these are two sentences from early in the book, although the chronology that we'll go through in terms of my reading the sentences is not straightforwardly chronological in the book. So this sentence: we can begin by saying that Dropout Piece, first and foremost, is a title, a concise fragment of language indicating, with the word peace, the application of art's frame around a certain zone of defiant, difficult, and joyously rebellious thinking, represented by the ambiguous but decisive compound dropout. And then the second sentence, which also relates to this, is peaceness, it turns out, is a quality of dispersion, a cumulative effect kept hazy around the edges, in addition to bewildering the art market and outwitting its capricious procedural assessment of monetary value. Lozano's problematizing of our ability to even recognize, let alone classify, her work as so many discrete pieces gets off on indiscretion. Her strategy harbors a disruptive politic on non-recognition and non-resolution, a conviction in the mind-expanding effects of sustained uncertainty. And I wonder about choosing this piece. It's not, I mean, as you are careful to say, how it even becomes a piece is difficult, but I wonder if you could talk about that and maybe sketch in this turn from the work that really inspires you, which is kept on some level in these notebooks, and a turn, Lee Lozano's turn away from, let's just sketch as painting and drawing, not that it's that definitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so that, I mean, it's a book that I would have wanted to write anyway, but because it's for the prompt of this series that is the one work series, that did direct me in a way, and made me begin with the question of like, well, if it's going to be one work, what would that be, and why would I choose one over the other, and then even just thinking about and the reason why I ended up choosing Dropout Piece as opposed to any number of the other life art pieces, which are these behavioral works she was working on at the same time as the Wave series, which were this major series of paintings that were not actually the last, but in a manner of speaking, the last painting project and body of work that she did. And I can talk more about their transition in a second. But I ended up feeling compelled to write on Dropout Piece for this series that is called the One Work series, because I feel like Dropout Piece really does question what one work even is, or what the bounds of a work might be, when a work begins or ends, where it is located in time and in space and in memory. So as opposed to some of the other life art pieces, which are again these behavioral works that she makes a distinction between acts in time versus when these acts get written up as a write-up, which kind of looks like a drawing that were sometimes exhibited at the time. They were in group shows. She had a small retrospective of these life art pieces in 1971. So as opposed to some of these other ones like Dialogue Piece or General Strike Piece or Grass Piece or No Grass Piece, Dropout Piece does not have a write-up. It was never exhibited. It only exists in the notebooks and in forms that do not adhere to the historical record. So more than most pieces, it wants to think about the bounds of one work and how expansive that can be and how dispersed piece-ness can be, and that's a really exciting possibility to me. I think that, let's see, what was I also wanting to say about Dropout? Well, another reason why I wanted to write on that for this in terms of the one work is that because it doesn't exist as a write-up or a drawing, it only really exists if we talk about it and if we remember it and if we get it down on record. Yeah. And so part of the project does feel like one of ensuring the survival of the piece, that's a big reason for writing it.
Well, it also would seem that one of the terms that Sarah's mentioned, life art, this strange hyphenation or not strange hyphenation perhaps, and the other would be info fiction. And I think because your choice of Dropout Piece really demands sorting through what or how info fiction is embodied or enacted, or it can't, that term and its both its power and its instability is answered by, okay, there are several more than mentions of something called Dropout Piece, and in one of the mentions she underlines the P-O-U-T in Dropout, so it is about pouting, and maybe that's part of what you get to perform as well. So.
Yeah, totally. It's in these notebooks that all this like wordplay happens, and in terms of like that first excerpt you read about Dropout Piece existing primarily as a title and not necessarily being explained, but as a title, and I do think about her as a writer so much, and her use of language and her conviction in language as being transformational and turning something that would otherwise be like a bummer into a piece and an act of intentionality. So, and even that term dropout opens up for me a lot in the book as being this compound with a lot of meaning packed into it, both like references to dropping acid or dropping out of orbit, a kind of spaciness, or she was really following physics at the time and thinking a lot about science and gravity and weight and like the weight of dropping, and or like the weight of dropping being related to being stoned and that kind of weight. So there's like a lot of different directions that even just that word can move us in, and her puns like cerebellius indicate that she's thinking in that way.
Yeah. Let me read a little bit more. Just one, I think, about life art. From roughly the middle of the book. Life art put Lozano's body at the center of her take on conceptual art, not only in gendered terms of subject matter or style, writing by hand while the guys typed, but in its sensitivity to pleasure, its addiction to turn-ons, adrenaline, erogenous zones, sensory deprivations, and literally masturbatory self-centeredness. Her subjectivity had to be highly systematic and rule-bound as she treated her body like a test tube, researching states of hyperbolic self-awareness. And I wonder if you could talk about your negotiation into print of Lee's hand in relationship to that piece, in particular, Dropout Piece, but also many of the life art pieces.
Yeah, that is a big part of the experience of the notebooks, is that they are written by hand, and they include color-coded calendars in them where she has a legend for different kinds of things she wants to mark, whether they are certain kinds of orgasms or when she's dropping acid or when she scores weed or whatever it might be. So there are these like color-coded things that really are quite a bit like drawings. And then there are these calendars, these other logs of calls made and calls received and visits made and visits received that she calls real junkie play, this kind of obsessive note-taking of all of her interactions. And the hand is really present. It's really an important part of it. And yeah, the body is at the center of the way that she experiences and lives conceptual art, because it's going on all around her, but it is different the way it comes out of her hand and body versus Dan Graham, who she's really close with. So yeah, I mean, that is a challenge in writing the book, wanting to retain her hand but not being able to through type. So something does feel lost. I mean, what happened in terms of during the writing of it is I spent a lot of time indexing the notebooks, and that's something that we talked about, and I had to put it aside and something I want to complete, but the notebooks have over 1,000 pages. I mean, they're small pages, but a lot of text, and the index became a way of trying to deal with that and trying to track her return to certain ideas throughout these 11 notebooks. And then in terms of the body being at the center of her, I guess I kind of meant to explain it just for people who don't know from your last question, but I can now, that this idea of life art, or this project, was a parallel track that happened while she was painting these wave series. And she was working on the wave paintings, which have a mathematical system that generates their form, but from 67 to 70, and each painting, each one is 96 inches tall, they're all the same height, and she would paint each one in one go, and each panel gets increasingly complicated. The central form is an increasingly complicated form, and they're painted wet on wet, and it's really all about the texture of this vertical wave form versus the ground around it, and the painting of the paintings became a feat of endurance. And she was, at this point, you will not be surprised to hear, she was stoned throughout, she says. And so an amount of intoxication was an important part of the process of making these things, but then the sleeplessness, the dizziness of that, the duration of each panel, that is what propelled her into shifting gears after wave paintings to life art exclusively, pretty much. So it was that experience of painting that opened up this other way of working.
And I think there might be a place now. One of my favorite pages in the book, and I have a backstory note, was a great struggle with Afterall to get it in, is this page right here. And that's Sarah's hand, not Lee Lozano's hand. And maybe you could say a little bit about that as obviously related to indexing, but it happening in a very different way, and maybe index becoming map.
Yeah, totally. Well, you kind of said it. There you go. But yeah, I mean, I didn't put those two together when you asked it the first time, but in terms of trying to keep her hand present, I couldn't keep necessarily her hand present other than in the illustrations, but this was a way of doing that, is to put my hand into it. And because of this series as an existing established form that is pretty rigid, it was hard to get it in, so that was like the accomplishment or something. And it's the way I've been thinking about her since the map has changed, and now Dropout is at the center of it. Before, in earlier versions, drugs were at the center of it, early versions that Bruce had seen in 2007, but that is the way that, I don't know if it's specific to me, it feels really natural, but one of the things that she's working through is the simultaneity of a lot of different pieces or works happening at the same time, and similarly I feel like I couldn't hierarchicalize or like prioritize these different ideas. They had to all be flowing and happening in the same field. So this felt like the only way that, in fact, when I was asked to deliver an outline for the book, I tried to pass this off. It did not fly. But this was like, this is my outline for the book. And like, nice try. That doesn't work. But it really is the way, these things are, and this is like, it's more simplified. There could be lines connecting basically every bubble to each other. I don't know, she makes things more and more complicated. So that's kind of like, yeah, definitely, and indexing and mapping kind of becoming the same impulse.
Well, complication and difficulty are, ongoing love affairs of both of ours in terms of how women are difficult and complicated and important that way. So here's a sentence that goes directly to some of that. This is again from the book and Sarah writing, she was disturbed and embarrassed by what she saw as the subordinate, pathetic role women played and revolted against the association. When Caspar Koenig, the book dealer, curator based in Cologne for years and years, told her, quote, you are a good painter and a nice girl, Lozano lashed back, wrong on both counts. I'm a very good painter and not a nice girl. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about the exhilaration of Miss Lozano's difficulty.
Yeah, it has not diminished. The difficulty is not, for working on her, it doesn't feel like that long, but 7 years, and I feel like I'm in the middle of this work too. There's more that I want to think about. She's just as difficult. Boycott Piece feels just as hard. I'm not going to defend it or try to make it sound nice.
Do you want to just sketch what it is, because everyone may not know.
Right, totally. So Boycott Piece is one of the more notorious of the life art pieces, and it's actually a bit of a misnomer to call it Boycott Piece, even though that's what it's always called, because she never wrote that, and she was very specific about titling. So she refers to it in a loose leaf page from 1971 as Boycott Women, and it was an action that she took in August to stop talking to women. And when she first writes this, or this is like the piece of writing that gets reproduced again and again as the evidence of Boycott Piece, but she writes that she is stopping communications with women for about a month, after which she expects, which doesn't say she expects, but that communication will be better than ever. What happened, it's hard to talk about because who really knows, but alleged, or like the way it's talked about is that that continued kind of for the rest of her life, and that she avoided women and often wouldn't talk to them. And in talking to Dara Birnbaum years ago, they were in a crit group together, and Lozano would not directly address her. If she wanted to address a point that Dara made, she would route it through a man or something, which is crazy. So that's a difficult piece. But then as Bruce has put in writing a long time ago, she also did go to live with her mother in Dallas at a certain point and had regular communications with her parents. And the woman who took over her loft in Soho was a woman and remembers her fondly and has good memory. So I think that it's probably specifically women in the art world that she targeted. It's difficult. But I do see a lot, and in her notebooks, which is where she put this thing, wrong on both counts, I'm a very good painter and not a nice girl. There are other moments where she talks about illegalizing marriage and having ovary and sperm banks, and a lot of things that really resonate with Shulamith Firestone and Valerie Solanas. So as much as whatever we do with Boycott Piece, which is change, or I couldn't make any conclusive statement about it. It's a difficult piece, but there's a lot in it to think about for sure. She also aligns in a lot of ways with really radical feminist voices of the time. But yeah, difficulty. She was also, what remains in terms of people's memory, quite free and active sexually, and had a lot of partners. She also is remembered around this time at a party at Weston Naif, the curator's house. This has become, I'm surprised almost how much this gets brought up, but slitting her wrist, or not her wrist, her palm, the palm of her hand, and that kind of killing the party, but but being a very memorable moment for everyone who was there. So, and people, when I talk to them now about her, it's again 40 years later, there's a cringe that happens often. I think that people were scared of her. She was a very difficult woman, but she also talked about which is something that I don't have in writing, but that I have through people who she lived with, wanting to be an agent of dis-ease, as in the opposite of ease, and like acting on that intention after dropout. So it's all very considered and intentional, and yeah, I mean, it not casual.
Yeah. Well, there's maybe it's a good time to talk about actionist is one of the words you use to describe her events. So I'll read two things which chime for me around this: the intensity, but also the kind of physics of Lozano's thinking and how it is felt as a force in the world. Quote, again from Sarah, Lozano was a different kind of activist, more of an actionist. And there's a amazing footnote that Sarah's written to this line. Once and for all, the sum of myself to date is in terms of the verb, not the noun, the act, not the word. That's a statement of Lozano's in her notebooks. I'll read it again. Once and for all, the sum of myself to date is in terms of the verb, not the noun, the act, not the word. And Sarah then asks this question, which prompts the open question, what is the verb to Lozano? And then just as maybe a rider on that, but getting back to what to Lozano might be, quote, the artist was the enema of society, and dysfunction was a critical position to be staked out on the margins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hooray.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that difficulty is tied up with this dysfunction and feeling the, like, ethical and moral imperative of enacting that, and as an act of social responsibility, actually. And I think that something else that it brings up that's so important to thinking about her, especially through the lens of Dropout Piece, is her pursuit of danger, and that actually became a really important, had an important, like, kind of gravitational pull on her that she wrote about, that she would pursue something for the sake of its danger, like that would be enough. And
part of that danger could be, as you put it, at a certain point, not disappearing from New York, but playing to a different crowd, i.e. a younger crowd and a CBGB's crowd on some level, rather than an art world crowd, which would be maybe her age, 10 years older than this younger crowd.
Yeah,
that
totally.
kind of thing as a dangerous move, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so when she dropped out, there has been a question of, like, where did she go? And it turns out that she didn't go far at all. She was in New York for a decade that was otherwise kind of considered a blank spot, or that no one knew what was going on with her. But she was in New York. She was just hanging out with a totally different crowd, and that's an interesting way to think about dropping out as being a generational shift. So and then to think about, I was trying to think about what to Lozano is. I don't know. Here's some efforts. As a verb, if it were a verb, it would be, I mean, these are kind of simple answers maybe, but to pursue total revolution, simultaneously personal and public, which comes from this statement she made at the Art Workers Coalition open hearing in '69, and she made a long statement that included her declaration that she was not going to be an art worker, and this is at the Art Workers Coalition, but she's going to be an art dreamer, and that she would only pursue revolution simultaneously personal and public. And as opposed to Carl Andre, who made statements of similar strength, she actually kept stuck to it and lived it, which is a bit of a difference. Or to Lozano could be to believe in the transformational power of excessive intentionality to alter lived reality. It might mean to experiment on oneself, on one's body, according to the demands of uncompromising aesthetic intention. It could also mean to go underground in the Duchampian sense. It could also mean to realize disappearance as joyous breakthrough despite danger and deleterious consequences. it could mean to pay such intense, go-for-broke attention to something that one alters the thing attended to through sheer mental force. It could mean to connect so intensely and then to disappear and break that connection. And it would also mean, it could mean, which is something that she wrote, to give in to one's wildest fantasies, which connects also to being immoderate in matters of aesthetic and bodily experience. And that's to be immoderate outside of the parameters of capitalism, where money is not an issue, or which she specifically removed. It could also mean to break something. To Lozano, could mean to break something. And to disrupt entrenched patterns of production, both of value and meaning. So those are some possible definitions of the verb, if she's a verb. And she did talk about that a lot, her investment in the verbal or verbal and being a verb, which I think also connects to how she changed her name after Dropout Piece, and the last name that she went by was E, just the letter E, which could stand for a lot of things, but certainly stands for energy. And it's all about the movement of that energy and it as a verb.
Maybe pick up, we can pick up some of the things about that verb to Lozano and what it affects. And here are two other sentences. One, Dropout works to delineate the edges of art's economy and history, its limits, blind spots, forgetfulness, and aporia. And then Dropout was a matter of redefining contact and loss, investigating degrees of closeness and disappearance to achieve a distance in proximity. The decision not to leave material traces in the visual culture went hand in hand with a conviction that her kind of aesthetics required quality face-to-face time and intersubjective encounters, except with women. The boycott on direct female communication remained in effect. I wonder about one of the ways that the book operates is that you have intense face-to-face communication of a sort with, at least at E, maybe like the energy that she left in, you know, a ripple effect of that. And I wonder if you could talk about how that has altered, maybe physically and cerebellously, your own desire for a move toward face-to-face contact as an aesthetic zone.
Yeah, that did become a major part of, or I ended up discovering that was a major part of what Dropout Piece was about. And I think, well, on the road to that is realizing that she was thinking, she used this idea of multiply by T, multiplying by time. So thinking about any action she was taking as life art or whatever it might be, and thinking about what that action would mean in 10 years or in 20 years, or like, she was thinking and writing a lot about this. So, and also this was a shared conversation with artists like Kaltenbach, who's doing time capsules. But so this thinking about how an action reverberates or what the ripple effects are, and also thinking in terms of physics. Similarly, she really liked this idea of high energy scattering, that one way to detect indetectable particles would be through the ripple effects that they have indirectly on the environment around them. But so like with the long view and thinking about the action in the long term, I came to see the Dropout Piece ended up also being about, in terms of delineating the limits and the blind spots and the forgetfulness of art history, it ended up being so much about the contingencies of how history gets written and when it gets written and how that affects what is remembered or what is around, who's still around to do the remembering. And if you get in touch with them in time, if they happen, as like Kaltenbach says, how big their photograph box is, and if they happen to have images left. So like I really do see her anticipating all of these things in Dropout Piece, and looking ahead to thinking about how memory and love and all these things that you can't control will inform how the piece gets written as history. And certainly she's thinking about dropping off the radar and not being seen and not being on the historical record for a time, but then re-entering that after some delay. So yeah, but then there's this paradox where dropping out from the art world, again, since we already mentioned that for at least 10 years that was a shift in generation, so that whatever that means to drop out of the art world, she was still around artists and musicians. So, that went hand in hand with focusing her practice between bodies and like within through direct transmission of information and ideas, so that she wasn't going to put something down in writing that we could read 40 years later, but she was going to have really intense interactions with and do her work with people face to face. So this like face to face direct transmission became what her practice was all about after a certain point. And that it's amazing that, so like if that wouldn't leave any trace and would be so ephemeral and immaterial, that it would retain the power that it does for me now, and that power would come through is incredible, but it totally does. And it has, I feel like it's taught me a lot through that, yeah.
In terms of finishing this phase of your Lozano studies and coming off what you're talking about, the face-to-face, I wonder, Sarah curated a really amazing show at Overdoing and Kite, and the publication for that show is, I think there are a few copies available in the bookstore. It's called Joint Dialogue. And I wonder, like, was doing that show and working in such close proximity with Dan Graham and Stephen Kaltenbach, two of her closest interlocutors for a long time.
Yeah.
And Dan Graham was one of the few people that wrote, an artist that wrote really cogently about her work, and I think got it in a way that many people didn't. And I wondered, like, how did that moment, which comes about 2 to 3 years before the book is, you're working on the book, but it's also...
It's before,
okay.
It's before that project about the three of them and the relationships that she had with Dan Graham and Kaltenbach, that came before this was even a possibility, really. Okay. But yes, definitely, that changed the way I think about a lot of Lozano, and realizing the life art work that she did write up, like Dialogue Piece, was already pointing in that direction and making clear that so much of what she was negotiating was what's made public, what's kept private, which seems like a really important thing to think about today for obvious reasons. Like, when do you choose to keep things opaque and non-disclosure, and so like in Dialogue Piece she would note who came over, but she would never say what they talked about, and that was like spelled out in the directions of the piece, that you wouldn't double load, that you wouldn't distract from the intensity of the interaction by taking notes, which I totally would do all the time, but she wouldn't. So and similarly with Dropout Piece, it only really makes sense in relationship to what she was dropping out from, and it's so much about these, like, forging these relationships that were so generative and then severing them, and the severing resonates because the relationship was so intense. Particular and intense. Yeah. I also think that idea of like distance and proximity, which was in a passage you read, I don't know, it can go both ways. It can also be like proximity and distance. I think that both work. But I think that also, it comes out of a lot of things, but it comes out of taking seriously states of intoxication and drug use and alterity. So like being right here all the time or something. Yeah.
Well, there's one of my favorite terms of the many terms that Sarah reintroduces into an art discourse is contained in this next sentence. So Robert A. Hainley played with the observer effect in his science fiction term grok, meaning, quote, to understand so thoroughly that the observer becomes a part of the process being observed, end quote. And Lozano vibed with its acid trippiness, quote, at Kaltenbach's I grok art catalog conceptions, end quote. A grokked concept is so deeply absorbed that it becomes part of the thinker, and she puts some of herself back into it, evolving the concept through usage, as in, I grok Lozano. How is grokking on Lozano? What has it done for your tolerance about certain things going on right now?
Yeah,
both writing-wise, in terms of your own space, but also then just viewer reception.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, I don't know how I could answer this a couple ways, but I think that what working on Lozano and grokking Lozano has done has like burrowed me into a more focused, and I think it's helped me, or I don't know if it's helped me, but it's taken me to a place that's like more single-minded and has kind of more, not tunnel vision, but like trying to focus and clear space actually to like where grokking can happen. And that can't happen if they're like it. Like the thing about grokking is, I don't know if I can talk about grokking, but the thing about grokking is that it's very destabilizing and it's dangerous. It's a little scary because it involves this porousness of self, and where the thing being studied, especially with Lozano, this idea which is related to the observer effect, or which she was thinking so much about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but like that the observer and the observed start to lose their separation and like flow into each other or blur into each other. I mean, nothing could be more exciting, but it's also threatening and scary, and I don't know, it needs to be done in private maybe because it's scary. So it does. It maybe has taken me more into like a private headspace.
And
yeah.
both the danger, joy of the contact high with Lozano. Because there's something about grokking which it is like, what is the high going to be like? What's the trip going to be like?
Yeah, totally.
Like, and
like, here we
she's
go.
in control of that. I'm not.
Yeah,
yeah. One of the ways to kind of loop back to the beginning of the book, just one sentence from very early on. It's, we get access to her record of self at the time we would most want it, right when she was acting most awesomely on great leaps of consciousness. And then to connect that with I guess on some level one of the visual epigraphs for the book, which are these pages from the notebooks. And before any reader gets to Dropout Piece, she or he encounters on the page of Lozano's notebooks across from the one where Dropout Piece first appears, these questions from the artist to herself. Quote, do I want to study from books as weapon to use when participating in world, or do I want to search for new knowledge, info systems, invent other ways of learning for myself? And I wonder, maybe in terms of dropping out of this conversation, if we could talk about her insistence and pursuit of new knowledge and what that looks like, what that sounds like. Her voice comes through so strongly. It's not just the look of her hand, which you see on the notebook page, but the way you have a sense of what her voice was like. And it's one of the reasons I love the Frampton and I love the cover of the book, because there's just, I don't want to downplay the difficulty in every sense, but there's a lot of joy, a lot of dancing, Nietzschean dancing.
Yeah.
And where does that leave you? And in terms of maybe looking ahead, in terms of what an index might entail, what do you think? I mean, I clearly don't think it's just going to be a straightforward index. So I just wonder if you could talk about that effect.
I've been thinking about, I mean, again, like with grokking, I can't quite separate where one thing ends and the other begins often, but her coining this idea of infofiction has been really important to me, and I think is is a lot of what she's talking about or is another way that she refers to this new knowledge or new info system that she's pursuing that's outside of there she talks about books, but is particular to her, that could only come from oneself, which is something that we've talked a lot about. Yeah. But that's where the new knowledge would be, which takes a lot of work and is difficult, and I don't know how that's really done yet, but that's the work that I think needs to be done, is to figure out where objective reality and my own flawed or whatever particular interface with it happen, and what that looks like. And so she's like framed that for me in a very useful way. She's also, in terms of the new knowledge what she's imparted to me as new knowledge, is the possibility of exultant refusal or affirmative refusal or positive negation, or however you want to phrase it, but that saying no and not doing something can be a really life-affirming action and a joyful one. And she talks about the dropout, it leads to the unknown, which she calls the thrill of all thrills. So there's a lot of hopefulness too, at the same time that there's undoubtedly a lot of pain that went into that. I think that also what's important to her prioritizing this new knowledge, because she does think and talk about life art and the work that she's pursuing as kind of a technology for the future, for society. She thinks a lot about self-survival art and how, so she's constantly raising the stakes. I mean, they couldn't get any higher with her, but that is a reminder that I need often. And I think about that a lot too, like self-survival art and what do I need versus what am I being told to look at or like. So, yeah.
And that can be, I mean, she called Dropout Piece, along with another in a similar format, like the hardest work she ever did. And I think that also is an important qualification of dropping out is not lackadaisical. It's if you can head towards someone with great velocity and force, you can also remove yourself with an equal kind of force. And I think that's, her framing it that way is important to all of this.
Totally, because the thinking that happens before Dropout Piece, or like where her practice evolves, requires that dropout happen, and that's why it happens. So it's like the logic and the convictions she holds in her practice and the logic of it point inevitably to this action. So it's not even that she wants to leave the scene necessarily, but that she has reasoned herself to a place where she has to act on that, and that is a rare thing, actually. It's a really rare thing. So to act on, I mean, that's the other thing too with like biography and art in this book, but it's an issue always, but it's particularly an issue with Lozano where life art unites them, but the life matters most when it's a function of art and when it comes out of one's practice, as opposed even more than the other way around, even more than life informing art is when art can dictate what life has to do. And that's like a really hardcore, intense stance that I don't think any of us actually want to deal with or think about the ramifications of, because it would preclude a lot of the comforts that we all want to live with. And a comfortable life of being an artist was not an option for the thinking that for where thinking took her. And she couldn't be a middle-class artist, and we don't really want to think about that because, it's hard to think about. But she's difficult that way. Yeah. So on that downer, well, I think that's it. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Sarah.